It looks like a mistake, like someone built a V8, then slapped the carbs on sideways. But this bizarre intake setup, it turned big Mopars into track-dominating monsters. In the late 50s, when American cars meant land yachts, Chrysler had a plan to make science beat brute force. The result? One of the wildest intakes ever bolted onto an engine, the Cross Ram. And the craziest part? It shouldn't have worked, but it did. This is the story of the Mopar intake so dumb, it actually worked, the Cross Ram. Section 1. What is the Chrysler Cross Ram? So what is it? And why does it look like something out of a mad scientist's garage? The Cross Ram intake made its public debut in 1960 atop Chrysler's 413 cubic inch RB big block V8, offered on Chrysler's 300F and its sporting cousins from Dodge and Plymouth. The Cross Ram was instantly outlandish. Two giant 4-barrel carburetors, perched far apart from each other at each edge of the V8. But the real insanity? These carbs weren't just spaced out for show. They fed their cylinders through runners over 30 inches long, which crisscrossed over the engine's valley, snaking under the air cleaners, forming a tangle of pipes that boggle the mind even today. You'd pop the hood of a Chrysler 300F or a Ram Charger Super Stock, and the sight looked, well, like a factory error. Air cleaners the size of pizzas, carbs mounted not on the intake's center, but almost hanging over thin air, with crossover tubes linking both sides. Mopar people called it the long ram, compared to a short ram intake used on street models, which had runners about 15 inches long, and all of it sat on the top-tier RB big blocks. First the 413, later the near-mythical 426 Max Wedge, and on rare experimental platforms, even Hemi engines. To wedge this hardware under the hood, Chrysler sometimes had to move the battery to the fender. In some models, even the windshield wiper motor was relocated. This wasn't just another bolt-on. It was a whole new way of thinking. Section 2. Why did Chrysler build this Frankenstein? Here's the heart of the story. The Cross Ram wasn't just built for looks, or to confuse dealership grease monkeys. Chrysler's engineers in Highland Park weren't thinking about wowing car show crowds. They were chasing physics. At the dawn of the 60s, most intakes were simple. Short, fat runners bolted straight to the carb. But Chrysler research teams, led by visionaries like Tom Hoover, who later shepherded the Hemi, wondered, what if we could use the air, not just as a fuel mechanism, but as fuel with momentum, almost like a battering ram, hence the name, Ram Charger. How? The answer was ram tuning. Every time an intake valve closes, a wave of air pressure travels up the runner, then rebounds. With the right length of pipe, the returning wave, helped by the inertia of fast-moving air, arrives at the intake valve just as it opens, shoving more oxygen into the cylinder. Long runners mean the resonance effect hits hard at low to mid RPM, boosting torque right where these big Mopars needed it. The Cross Ram's more than 30-inch runners were tuned, not guesstimated. Chrysler's engineers ran actual oscilloscopes and pressure sensors on the dyno, mapping pressure waves and exhaust pulses in real time. They calculated and cut every bend for maximum effect, acoustic harmonics, in an era when most brands thought science meant cubic inches and chrome valve covers. The result? Big cars making muscle car torque, from just above idle to redline. Fun fact, Chrysler engineers were running this kind of in-depth waveform analysis nearly a decade before most factories even thought about pressure waves, putting them decades ahead of mainstream intake manifold design. Section 3, what did it actually do? Okay, enough theory. How did it work in the real world? The Cross Ram's effect was simple, dramatic, and impossible to miss. Owners quickly discovered that these big Chryslers left their competitors in the dust at stoplights. The 1960 Chrysler 300F with a Cross Ram 413 could launch from 0 to 60 miles per hour in under 7 seconds, at a time when the average full-size car needed 10. Quarter mile, low 14s, occasionally better with sticky tires and a gutsy driver. Numbers faster than almost anything short of a Corvette Fuelie, and easily matching early GTO's years before the muscle car boom. And it wasn't just on the street. Chrysler shipped Cross Ram intakes with its Max Wedge drag racing parts, a package aimed at super stock and factory drag teams eager to prove their worth at the strip. Teams like the famous Ram Chargers built local legends with Cross Ram Max Wedges, while the car's oddball looks led insurance companies to underrate them. They'd see the sprawling intake, the battery in a weird place, and think, no kid's gonna be hot rodding that. They were wrong. Meanwhile, out on the high banks, Chrysler's NASCAR efforts also leveraged Cross Ram technology. The long runner Max Wedges laid the groundwork for more advanced big block Mopars through the early 60s, especially on short ovals where torque trumped all. And for a cherry on top, at high enough RPM, those runners could actually produce a supercharging effect. Inertia kept moving air into the cylinders long after atmospheric pressure would have stopped. No turbo, no blower, just clever physics and gutsy engineering. Section 4. Why it vanished and who copied it. But if it was so great, why isn't every V8 sporting 30-inch snaky intakes today? The downfall of the Cross Ram came not from the drag strip, but the real world. The runners and carbs took up enormous space under the hood. The complex assembly weighed significantly more than regular dual-plane intakes. Tuning was more finicky. Each runner had to be leak-free, perfectly matched, or else the whole effect was lost. And as racing changed, competitors realized that shorter runners and dual-plane intakes offered better mid-range punch and higher ultimate horsepower without nearly as many headaches. By the mid-1960s, Chrysler began shifting to cross-bolted, shorter runner short ram intakes for street cars, reserving the long runners for race-only models. Even so, its Cross Ram DNA lived on sometimes much more quietly. General Motors and Ford couldn't help but copy the science. In the 1980s, Chevrolet rolled out the tuned port injection intake for the C4 Corvette and F-body, with a spaghetti maze of runners almost directly inspired by the Mopar Cross Ram. Its effect, giant torque at low to mid RPM, and a look that instantly screamed, something's different under that hood, was pure Cross Ram. Even if electronic injection replaced carburetors, Ford, never one to be left behind, fiddled with similar long runner intake ideas, most famously in the SHO V6, where runner length got adjusted via butterflies at high RPM. They killed it because it was weird, and then quietly copied it for the next 40 years. Section 5. The comeback. Modern tech. And here's the kicker, the Cross Ram was never really dead. It just evolved. Modern Hemis, including the 5.7-liter, 6.1-liter, and 6.4-liter, use dual plenum or variable length intakes that mimic the Ram tuning effect, a legacy straight from those wild 60s Mopars. You might not see 30-inch runners and sideways carbs, but inside, the idea is the same. Tune airflow, so the engine's torque and power band can be shaped at will. In the performance aftermarket, companies like Indy Cylinder Head and Ray Barton Racing still sell Cross Ram style manifolds, now optimized for today's fuels, cams, and cylinder heads. Want to freak out the crowd at a Mopar meet or build a period-correct super stocker? You can buy a Cross Ram today, bolt it to a 426 Max Wedge, and make headlines all over again. And that shouldn't have worked reputation? Turns out, it's just the natural skepticism great ideas always face. The Cross Ram's original air cleaners had crossover tubes, amplifying both the intake volume and the visual weirdness. They looked like angry insect eyes staring back at you. Factory setups were so large, they sometimes required reshuffling half the engine bay. Moving the battery to make room for the runners was just step one. Long Ram and Short Ram names were coined by factory engineers, and both have a rabid following today. Insurance companies during the early 60s didn't realize how quick these monsters really were because the intake looked more like an experiment than a threat. A loophole racers exploited for years. It was ugly, it was heavy, it looked wrong, but it allowed full-size Mopars, the so-called boats, to launch with world-beating fury, smoking tires, and blowing past GTOs, Corvettes, and just about anything else that dared to line up beside them. They said it was the intake that shouldn't have worked. But on the track and on the street, it proved everyone wrong. And sometimes doing things the weirdest possible way is the only way to beat the system. Want more stories about wild engineering, genius failures, and the greatest underdog moves in automotive history? Hit that like, smash subscribe, and tell me, if you could build any Cross Ram-powered Mopar, what would it be? And would you leave the battery in the trunk just for old time's sake? This is the legend of the Chrysler Cross Ram, icon weird science, track killer.